If Tony Seba, Cathy Wood, and others are correct, then the dominance of electric vehicles in the transportation sector is as inevitable as gravity. Plus, is hardware 4 or maybe even hardware 5 necessary for Tesla to solve full self-driving? For a long time, I thought so, but I'm starting to reconsider that opinion. Let's take a look. Hey y'all, it's Dr. Know-It-All. I want to start with looking at a quick video that Joe Tegmeyer did a few days ago now of a Cybertruck making a turn at Gigafactory, Texas. The turn is really impressive. If you drive a Tesla, certainly the Model Y and the Model 3 to some extent also, the turning radius on those vehicles is not fantastic, and I think it has to do with the electric motor and the lockout of the maximum turning angle for the tires. But of course, the Cybertruck has that lovely advantage that it has rear wheel steering, so it almost looks like magic when you see it making that U-turn. It's really impressive. And I don't know that my Model Y would be able to make that U-turn in that tight of a curve. I'm not sure. It might be close. It's a little hard to tell because the truck is so big that it might be skewing things, but it would be a challenge for the Model Y to make that turn in that sort of radius. But also, of course, the acceleration that you see out of the vehicle is just super impressive. So anyway, add that to the list of things to get excited about when the Cybertruck delivery event happens. All right, so on to Tesla and other EVs' eventual inevitable dominance in the transportation sector. What am I talking about here? This was actually inspired by looking at the price cuts that Tesla's been doing, particularly in China recently, which is turning into a very, very difficult market for everybody, not just Tesla, of course. And if you haven't seen that video, you can check that out up here where I talk about it in more detail. But basically, you've got Tesla and they've been pushing everybody else, but other EV manufacturers are doing this at the same time. They're all reducing their prices significantly, and many in the press are saying like this is just a race to the bottom of the bowl and everyone's going to go broke because there's going to be no money to be made or anything. But of course, if you believe Tony Seba from like years ago, like around 2010 or so, and certainly Cathy Wood in the last 5 or 6 years or so, you can hear these folks talking about this exact inevitability. And that is that if you believe Wright's law, and it's pretty well established at this point, there are some situations where Wright's law doesn't apply as much. And if you haven't seen my talk with Adam Dorr, you should definitely check that out as well. He's a lead researcher at RethinX, and they really, really think a lot about this stuff. But anyway, basically every doubling of production of most products in history, there's a certain percentage of reduction in cost. So if you make 100 of something, it costs $100. If you make 200, it might cost $85. And so it goes down 15%. And each time you double that amount, it goes down 15%. And of course, the problem for legacy auto is that the gas automobiles have been around for a long time, and there have been billions and billions of them produced. So to double the billions that have been produced is going to take a very long time. It's not something that you just pop out and you're just like, okay, we've produced another, 5 billion vehicles or something. Whereas for electric vehicles, they're getting a Wright's law reduction of somewhere in the 20s, around 24 or 25% reduction in cost every time you double the manufacturer. And there are several reasons for that. One is just it's a new technology, so building out the factories, figuring out how to make them efficiently, figuring out how to make motors efficiently, all of that stuff takes time, and every time they double production, they get better and better at that. But there's a secondary factor that's happening at the same time, which is the reduction in cost of batteries. That, again, still is the major cost component of an electric vehicle, and there's a lot of batteries in these vehicles, but the fact of the matter is we're seeing all of these companies, CATL, LG, BYD, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We're seeing these companies produce more and more and more batteries. And of course, this production started before electric vehicles. It started in the 1990s with laptops, and then of course we got to, smartphones, cell phones, things like that. So there were a lot of smaller use cases where you could have a relatively high price battery because you didn't need that many. Those began to drive the cost of lithium ion and LFP and all the chemistries that are in the lithium ion family of battery chemistries. Anyway, it began driving those down because of course you're manufacturing batteries. But again, for cell phones and laptops, etc., you're looking at really small quantities of batteries compared to vehicles, which they go from, needing less than 1 watt hour of battery power to needing like kilowatt hours of battery power. So you need way, way, way more to push a car around just because it's a very, very heavy object. So by the mid 2000 aughts, like say 2005 or so, you could start to see this battery drop that was happening and the inevitability of the reduction of the price of this type of battery. And if you projected that out, and Tony Seba, to his credit, in the late 20 aughts, started to talk about this and started saying, look, it's like gravity. This is something that's going to happen. It's going to reduce in price. You're going to see it. It's inevitable how much it's going to reduce in price, and it's going to shock everybody. And now, of course, pretty much every day you hear about a new battery factory that somebody else is building or some joint venture is building or something, and it's going to produce, 20 or 40 or 50 gigawatt hours of batteries per year once it's ramped up. And that amount of gigawatt hours into terawatt hours is actually creating a doubling that's happening very, very rapidly for the amount of batteries produced, because like all the batteries ever produced for laptops is a tiny little piece of all the batteries that have been produced for automobiles so far. And that's just so far. And then that number is going to increase and increase and increase. And every time it doubles, that's feeding into the reduction of cost of electric vehicles. So what we're looking at right now, we've got these price cuts that are going on, and they are hurting people. Like there's a lot of companies that are losing some money making their vehicles. Tesla is losing their margins to some extent. It's all being squeezed, and there's a lot of temporary reasons going on for this. But the reason that this is sustainable and not something where electric vehicle makers are just going to drive themselves and everybody else out of business is because these cost reductions are going to keep making it cheaper to build the EVs. Now, will many or most of the EV manufacturers go bankrupt? Yes, they will. This is the kind of sorting thing. Every time there's a big new industry, you get kind of a Cambrian explosion. You get a ton of new companies out there. They all want to do the thing. They all want a piece of that pie. They all want something of that. Most of them are not going to survive. They'll either go completely bankrupt, they will merge with other companies, something along those lines will happen. And so in the end, you'll end up with, the big 10 or so auto manufacturers. But the odds are that those 10 auto manufacturers are not going to be the big 10 auto manufacturers that existed 5 years ago. Those players are going to be small players to out of business by the time we get through with the EV revolution. And of course, for those who say that gas cars can keep up with electric vehicles and that they'll get cheaper too, and that people will keep buying internal combustion engine vehicles for another 10 or 20 years plus, that's simply not going to happen, because this precipitous decline in electric vehicles that can take place because the amount of electric vehicles is in the millions at this point, or maybe tens of millions. It's really easy. Like in 1 year, you can double 10 million and make 20 million electric vehicles. That's pretty easy. But when you think about internal combustion engine vehicles that have been manufactured, I mean, just think about not just in cars, but all the planes, all the military vehicles, all the trucks, all of that kind of stuff. Internal combustion engine vehicles have been made in the tens of billions at this point. So to make a doubling and get a price reduction out of internal combustion engine vehicles, you're looking at just an incredible amount of vehicles that will have to be produced. And that would take a decade, 2 decades, 3 decades, something like that, to double the amount of internal combustion engine vehicles made, whereas it can be done in a year at this point with electric vehicles. And that means that electric vehicles just have a fundamental advantage. Their cost curves are coming down faster because they're an immature technology. And the fact of the matter is they're very, very comparable already. They're very close to price parity. And of course, for us consumers, once you buy the car, it's a lot cheaper to own because electricity is generally cheaper unless you live in Texas and ERCOT starts charging $2,000 a megawatt hour or something. And of course, there's very, very little maintenance because electric motors have far fewer moving parts than gas motors. But even beyond that, just the sticker price of electric vehicles is going to keep falling. It's inevitable that it's going to happen. And it's going to put a lot of companies out of business. Not everyone is going to be able to keep up. But if you watch what Tesla and BYD and the main players are doing, they're able to keep reducing the prices. And that's not going to stop today or tomorrow. That's going to keep on going. And that reduction means that we can predictably say that electric vehicles within the next 4 or 5 years are going to be so much cheaper than a comparable internal combustion engine vehicle that why would a consumer purchase a gas car for more money than an EV and then have to spend more money on that vehicle over the lifetime of that vehicle than they will with an electric vehicle? Again, as Tony Seba, Cathy Woods, and others have been saying, this is an inevitability. This is like gravity. Tony Seba keeps keeps saying that. He's like, the math is like gravity. You can graph it out. You can figure out exactly how it's going to go, and it's going to go in the favor of electric vehicles. And finally, let me turn to Tesla's full self-driving and whether it's going to need hardware 4 or even potentially hardware 5 in order for the vehicles to drive on their own without human intervention. You know, in other words, you can sit in the back seat sort of situation. So for a very long time, I was of the opinion that we would need at least hardware 4 for Tesla to actually reasonably solve full self-driving. In other words, to have the calculation, the memory, the ability of the computer to process information fast enough to be able to do an effective job of driving on its own. And I still think that in the early days, we could be looking at needing something like hardware 4 to get there first, but I'm becoming more and more convinced that hardware 3 is actually going to be adequate. And the reason why is if we look at a large language model like ChatGPT or something, or Llama is an even better example of this. Llama is Meta's open source version of a large language model. These things cost hundreds of millions of dollars in large data centers to do the initial training of these large language models. But what's happening is once this stuff gets open sourced, people take this and they have figured out a way. There's a way of running Llama, a large language model, on a Raspberry Pi right now with 8 gigs of RAM in it. That's just tight. I mean, a Raspberry Pi is just like a little board. It's like a little portable plaything that you can mess around with and, you know, have some fun with or something. I've got one that like runs a bunch of retro games and all that stuff that's connected to my TV. But we're talking about a tiny little computer. You can put it on your phone now. There's a lot of examples where people have taken these large language models and they've crunched them down so that they actually work pretty reasonably well on a very, very small edge computing device. And the reason why this reduction is possible is that in the first place, until you know how to solve the problem, you have to expend a huge amount of resources. So again, I liken it to being in a forest at night, you know, in the woods, you're trying to figure your way out and you just keep bumping into trees and hitting your head, right? It hurts, you stub your toes, whatever. It's like, but once you eventually figure the way out, it seems much easier. In fact, it is much easier. You're like, oh, that's how I did it. And so you're like, okay, this is the path that you go on. And once you establish that path, and that path can be very expensive, the bumping your head and your feet into trees is computational cost, time, redoing architectures, things like that. You work through all of these variables and you keep going, you keep going, you keep going, and you expend a huge amount of computational resources. And then when you figure out what the solution to the problem is, you're like, oh, that's how you do it. And so you're going to need a lot of compute at the beginning because you haven't figured out how to do this efficiently. But once you figure that out, then you can go back and say, okay, now here's the solution. How do I now minimize the computation time, memory bandwidth, all of those costs? How do I streamline this thing? Once you know, like at the end point, what you've gotten to, then you can go back and reverse engineer all of the other steps to make them more and more and more efficient, especially for an inference engine. And so, like I said at the beginning, I was like, yeah, you know, I definitely think hardware 4 is going to be needed. And I think maybe even a generation after that might be needed in order to do this. But my thinking is that once Tesla gets this solved, or potentially another company, I don't know. But anyway, Tesla seems like they definitely have the best lead on this whole thing. But once they get this solved and once they know how it's solved, that is going to need a lot of compute resources at the beginning, but they can keep squeezing it and squeezing it and squeezing it and reducing the amount of compute resources, just like, again, taking Llama from a big supercompute cluster all the way down to a Raspberry Pi or your phone or something along those lines. So once you figure out the answer, going back and figuring out how to do it much more efficiently, that's something that you can do. And so while all of us, and I include myself in this list, always like the new hardware toy, we're like, ooh, it's faster, it's got more flops, it's got more memory, it's got more bandwidth, all of this kind of thing. While all of us get excited about that stuff, it's not as necessary as one might think. You can run a lot of really good stuff on 10-year-old laptops right now, right? So you can think about it that way. It's like those things still have a lifespan. They can still operate effectively because we've also figured out how to do things more and more and more efficiently. So like I said, I think at the beginning, it's going to take a huge amount of compute resources, and we may see temporarily that hardware 4 has an advantage over hardware 3, but I think that over time, we'll see a back propagation of reverse engineering engineering and a simplification of things to run on hardware 3 very effectively. And to tie this back into the cost of EVs, of course, if we get full autonomy, that means that we don't need to have as many cars on the road to replace all of the internal combustion engine vehicles, because of course each car can do a lot more use. It can drive about maybe 5x the amount of vehicles that are on the road right now. So one EV with autonomy could replace 5 internal combustion engine vehicles. And of course that efficiency, while it won't drive the cost of the actual cars down as rapidly as building more cars, is going to drive the cost of per mile transportation down, which for most of us is all we actually care about. So in short, the future is bright, the future is electric, and the future is autonomous, and also the future is Cybertruck. So stay tuned because the future is going to be awesome. All right, I hope you enjoyed this episode and found it fun and interesting and thought-provoking. If you did, please do like it so other people can find it, and of course consider subscribing for more of this kind of content. As always, a huge shout out to my patrons on Patreon, my YouTube channel members, and of course my ex-subscribers. Thank you all so much for supporting the channel in any way that you can, and of course if you want to join any of the teams, just check out the links in the description. And if you're interested in a whole bunch of really cool merch, check out our merch store. Link is in the description. We have Tesla Bot t-shirts, the Tesla meme t-shirt, Success is a Possible Outcome, 4680 battery cells. All of that stuff is on t-shirts, mugs, tumblers, and on and on. So check it out. And finally, don't forget we are both Tesla and Amazon affiliates. If you look in the description, you can see how going shopping for a new Tesla, a solar roof, a power wall, or anything on Amazon helps out the channel. In the meantime, I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye.